And I'll mute the line and then. Yeah, so normally what I would do in the class is I'd get everybody's homework assignments and go through them and then compile them into one document and send it out so that you could all see what each other were doing. And you folks really love to challenge me. I decided if everybody would write exactly the same and make the exact same mistakes, I could grade the homework assignments a whole lot quicker because I was working on this one all day long. I don't know that I can always promise to do that. So to get the best feedback, try to get your homework in before the day that it's due. I know some of you got it in last night, and you're the ones that I started working on early this morning. But I honestly did not finish until 5:30 today. So just general comments about the homework. One thing that struck me was some folks did not do the assignment the way I thought they were going to. So I turned some of that onus back on me. Was I clear enough when I was giving the assignment so that everybody understood it? I went back, I looked at my email again. I noted that in the presentation when I told you verbally what the homework assignment would be, I said we were just going to do the Western equipment. And then I changed that when I did the email. So, that tripped up one person. But going back and looking at the email again, I think I was being very detailed. But if you're finding that my instructions aren't really clear or you're not sure, please get in touch with me before you start working on it. Because I don't want you spending a lot of time and energy going down a path doing something that really isn't going to work for us. The other general comment, though, about the homework, and I think I gave all of you this in writing, is now we're getting into the meat. Now we're really beginning to put the words to paper and formulate the resume. And this is giving me the first chance to really see where are people's strengths and weaknesses, what are the gaps that I still need to fill. And that's where I said it'd be nice if you all had the same gaps, but you don't. So rather than going through each assignment separately tonight, just some general comments to keep in mind. Number one, don't forget that first session, the strategy session. That's essential. We didn't do that exercise as a one and done, set it aside, and now we're going to go back to doing what we were doing before. You really want to revisit that strategy session, revisit the profile, get acquainted with the candidate again, and begin to write around that strategy that you planned. So things that I saw that indicated that wasn't happening, there was language that wasn't probably the kind of language that Candace would use, probably not even the kind of language that a lot of us would use. So one example I read was there was a phrase that used the terminology, something about being promoted to aforementioned positions. We don't talk that way, and our clients don't talk that way. So the whole idea, I think, with resume writing is we want to bring out the client's personality. We want to speak in their voice. Resume writing is not some very stilted, regimented form of communication that we all have to adhere to. Granted, there are some general standards, like, we write in first person, but we drop out the personal pronouns. But that doesn't mean we shift from writing the way our clients speak to writing in legal terminology or writing in terminology that sounds very verbose and exaggerated. We tell the story the way the client would tell it. And we want the reader of the resume to be able to get a feeling for who is this client, how do they communicate. Because remember, when they go to the interview, they're going to reveal the real communication style. So if we go back and we look at Candace's profile again, we realize she's very casual. She's, she's not a high-level college graduate that, had multiple scholarships. She's just a down-to-earth woman, and we want to speak a little bit more like her. Other things, just general reminders, again, when we're writing, particularly for the NCRW, but in general for resume best practices, keep the job scope in a paragraph format. Always keep your writing paragraphs 5 lines or less. Otherwise, it's too dense. And that applies to every section of the resume, and it also applies to the cover letters. We digest information in very small bites. And now with email and text messages, it's becoming even more apparent that we don't like to wade through a lot of information or a lot of words to get the information that we're looking for. So be careful when you're formatting that you're being concise, but on the other hand, you also don't want to be choppy. Your job descriptions should flow. They should sound like you're reading maybe a story or a narrative, not short little clips of this, and this. So keep that in mind. Of course, the other thing, too, is when you're putting in your homework assignments, I want to see your best work. So don't send me things that have spelling errors, grammatical errors, missing words. I know everybody is super, super busy, and I would much rather you email me and say, I'm going to be late on this week's assignment, than to jump in and do a rush job and send it off, and now I'm getting something, and I don't know, wow, does this person really have a lot of problem with grammar and punctuation and spelling, or were they just in a rush and did not take the time to edit and proofread their own work? So that's another biggie that I stress going forward. Give me your best. If you don't have time to give me your best, ask for an extension so that I know what you're capable of. And I know from talking from all of you and, reading your emails, you're all very articulate. So it's not that you don't know how to put the words together. It's just something happens that when some of you are putting it into the resume, it's like you get very stilted and you forget how to communicate. Also, and related to the proofreading and the editing, one thing that I noticed, and I went back and I looked at DISC profiles for those of you that completed the DISC assessment. And if you remember from Jane's presentation, we look at different styles. And one of the styles that really works very nicely with people that do editing and proofreading is that C style, that person who is very, very in tune to quality and detail and accuracy. If that is not your natural strength, then you want to be aware of that and work even harder at paying attention to details. I know I had 2, and I might have had 3 homework assignments where Candace's name was misspelled. It was Candace instead of Dice. Little detail, but it makes a big difference. So be aware of what your strengths are and really build on them, but also be aware of where you might need an extra crutch. And I know that I need an extra crutch all the time when I'm writing. So if you're aware and you take more time to address that, you're going to improve your writing a whole lot more quickly. So that's just kind of general. You each got specific feedback. And if you have any questions after you've read that feedback, please let me know. It was tough for me to do this because I really like people and I really want to be encouraging and I really want everybody to feel good. And it's just difficult to take somebody's work and start chopping it up. It pains me to do it, but I have to keep reminding myself, you all paid a lot of money for this course. I would be doing you a disservice if I just said okay to every assignment, and in the end, you walk away, you keep doing what you were doing, you don't get certified, and then you're upset, rightfully so, because you spent a lot of money to learn something. So I personally want somebody to tell me if I'm not doing the best I can do. If anybody gets offended, please let me know, and I'll try to soften the delivery. That's being Italian, being the middle of 7 kids, and being from New York, I was often accused of not softening my delivery. So I won't be offended if you come back to me and say, ouch, that really hurt. Could we talk it through a little bit more? So that is my overview of the homework, and I'm going to take you off of mute and just kind of go down the list really quick, see if anybody had anything general that they want to ask, any comments, any suggestions on how we can make it run more smoothly. But let me do that, and then we'll jump into tonight's session. So let me unmute the lines. And again, reminder, if you're multitasking, please put your phone on *6 when I unmute the line. We don't want to hear any more dogs barking, kids playing, radios, conversations, just us. It's all us tonight. So here. Okay. Oh, Sheila, I forgot to call you in. Sheila, are you on the phone?
I am.
Oh, good. I forgot to call you with roll call. Did you have any general comments or questions, Sheila?
No, I think I wrote you an email earlier that I had misunderstood the assignment. I was thinking we were going to more formatting, so I'm excited to take a look at it from the accurate perspective of what we're trying to accomplish.
Formatting will come later, but yeah, thank you. I did glance at that email, and again, anytime somebody isn't quite sure, or even if you are sure and you still want me to reassure you, just shoot me an email or give me a call. Brenda?
Yes, I'm here.
Anything? Any other comments, questions on that little speech I just gave you all?
Oh no, I'm from Baltimore, so I have pretty thick skin, and I'm good.
Okay. Well, I certainly don't want to cause any pain for anybody. How about you, Tiffany?
Robert?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the first, when you say 5 lines, is that 5 lines versus 5 sentences in a paragraph?
Yeah, it's 5 lines of text, and that's a good distinction to make. So sometimes it may be more than 5 lines, and what you want to do is adjust your margins, adjust your font size, see if you could tighten up the writing a little bit more. It doesn't mean that you've got to stop writing when you still have something important to say, but, manipulate it. The other thing, too, and we didn't talk about it a whole lot, but if your paragraphs are getting dense, see if you can break it down into 2 paragraphs and keep similar information together in each. So that's another strategy. But the overall goal is get away from these really dense blocks of text that are immediately overwhelming. Okay?
Okay. I was looking.
Tiffany.
Thank you.
You're welcome. How about you, Suzanne? Are you on the line? No? LJ.
I thought the feedback was super helpful. I'm trying to take all the adverbs out of adverb overload.
Adverb and adjective. I had one other person in my last group that did that. Just loved to put in those words that describe things. So, yeah. It'll come, LJ. It'll come.
Well, right now it needs to go.
Oh. Stop reading romance novels. That's where it comes from. How about you, Ronnie? Anything?
Oh no, and truly, I want all that feedback. I love that. I need a lot of help, and I want it hard. hard as you can get it, please.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll do the best I can on that.
But you know, on mine where I didn't put the dates, that was intentional for me.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit more then, too. How about you, Doug? Doug, anything? I thought Doug was on the line. Okay. He was at one point. And Christina.
Hi there.
Hi there.
I appreciate the constructive feedback. For me, I think it's also helpful after each class to see you send out the example of like how you do it, just so we can get a sense of how a certified writer goes about tackling those as well.
And of course, I make mistakes. I can write tighter sometimes, and my strategy may not be the same strategy that other people will use. I debated about sending you what I did for her resume until we actually got through all of the lessons. I'll rethink that. I think what I'd like to do is go through this class and the previous classes, find the best examples, and then send you those so that you can see here's a variety of ways to do it. One thing that I found kind of interesting about this group was I think all of you that completed the whole assignment anyhow included all of her positions, and that's the first time that's happened. Not that you shouldn't include all the positions. That again goes back to your strategy. But I just found it interesting that those of you that broke down the positions did it for all of them. I can tell you that when I actually wrote this client's resume, I did a lot of combining of positions and summarizing those older ones. So again, it's just a different strategy. But interesting to see how people can handle the same client a little bit differently. And, going back, I think LJ brought this up once before, it would be a whole lot easier if we could get the client on the phone and ask for some more clarity. So hopefully we get to do that in our own practices. But that means you got to stretch a little bit harder with this particular program that we're doing right now. So I'm going to put this back on hold, and I'm going to go through accomplishments tonight. So let me mute the line. Okay, everybody is muted. Somebody give me the little heads up again that you're hearing me. Somebody chat. Thank you, Tiffany. At least I know one person's hearing me. Okay, so tonight we're going down to the next level of the professional experience section. We're going to try to hone in on what is the difference between the job scope and the actual accomplishments. So we're going to talk about that tonight in general terms, as well as how it applies to our candidate here, Candace. So what we're going to cover tonight is, we're going to revisit the strategy and keep that in mind, because that'll really help us to decide which accomplishments to focus on and how we want to structure those accomplishments. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit. I'm going to go over some ideas for actually getting those examples from clients. Consistently, resume writers tell me, and I've had that experience myself, sometimes it's very, very difficult to get examples from clients. They don't even understand this concept of accomplishments and contributions, or in many cases, they may not think they ever had any. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Going to give you some tips on how to quantify the accomplishments. It can't be done all the time, but when it can, you definitely want to quantify. And then I'm going to introduce something to you that I affectionately call the Macintosh methodology. Sally McIntosh was the certification chair for the NRWA for many, many, many years. And she did a presentation at one of our conferences, maybe 5-6 years ago, on how to develop an accomplishment statement. And it really stuck with me. So I decided I'd like to integrate her method into this course, teach you what she taught us at that conference, and in honor of Sally, I have christened it Macintosh Methodology. So no one outside of the NRAWA or outside of this class is really going to understand what that means. So, don't drop it on another organization and say, well, you didn't follow that Macintosh methodology, because they'll look at you like you've got horns coming out of your head. We'll talk a little bit about front-loading the accomplishment, and that ties back into that Macintosh methodology, and then, some of the basic formatting guidelines for writing accomplishments. So, keeping the strategy in mind, this is very important. You want to go back and look at those 8 elements that we addressed way back in the beginning of what goes into an effective strategy. We want to look at positioning. What accomplishments are going to position the client as the key competitor for the job that they're applying for? Relevance. Which accomplishments do you really want to put in there that are relevant to her goal? And how do you want to phrase them? Which element of that accomplishment do you want to emphasize? Which do you want to de-emphasize? So we'll talk about that. Keywords. You need to have the key words in there that are industry specific and that are in the job announcements. And then the overall tone. So before you begin working on the accomplishment bullets, again, go back and look at your strategy. And as a reminder, I mentioned in the first class when we were covering strategy, is that one of the techniques I use is to have general strategy items typed at the top of the document while I'm working on it. And as I develop content and I hone in on accomplishments, I look at those key elements and I ask myself, is this supporting what I am trying to communicate? Is this supporting the overall theme? So if you have that in front of you, either on the screen, on a sheet of paper, you can check your work while you're writing and make sure that it's effective and that it's targeted towards the strategy that you're trying to emphasize. You look at the skills that you want to emphasize most. If we look at Candace, we want to remember that we look at her overall theme. Things that she told us is that she's very good at bringing order to chaos. So we want some accomplishment that supports that. She's good at generating new business. We want to prove that by pulling out an accomplishment. She's willing to perform any task and is not afraid to jump in. So we got to find an example to prove that. It's not enough to just say it. We have to have examples in there to prove it. Then we look at her behavioral traits. And a lot of those came out of the DISC assessment. Very clearly, the wording said she was service-minded, bottom-line oriented, and driven to succeed. So as you're writing, you look for, how am I going to prove that? What can I include in the job scope? What can I include in the accomplishments that prove that she is service-minded, bottom-line oriented, and driven to succeed? And then even look at those preferred tasks. She says she likes building relationships, increasing the customer base, improving operations. So you want to look for examples that will support that. Don't put in there things that were not her preferred task. As I often tell my clients, if you put things in your resume that you don't want to do, I guarantee some employer is going to pull that resume up and invite you in for an interview for the job that you're really not wanting to do. So you've got to make sure that it's relevant and it's concise and it's communicating that brand. And then also think about some of those key words like vendors, customer service, marketing, sales, inventory. So you want to weave those into your accomplishment statements as well as in your job description statements. Here's some of the questions that I like to ask when I do these probing questions when I'm talking to clients. One of my favorite is asking them, what was the need? Why were you hired there? And some of you kind of caught that when you were writing the job description paragraph. You started out by saying hired to or recruited to. So that'll help you get kind of a focus. How have things changed? This is another really helpful one to get the client to focus on the accomplishment. What was going on when you got hired? How is it different now? And what role did you play in actually bringing about that difference? So drilling down and getting them to talk about that. Ask specific things. Did you ever identify a problem and solve it? And if you did, what were the results? Did you save the company time or money? You know, sometimes clients are like, well, you know, I wouldn't know. I don't have any control over the budget. Even a janitor can save the company time and money if they're going in there and maybe efficiently cleaning the office and making note of appliances that were drawing energy. There's always something buried in there that, you know, illustrates that the client has made a contribution. And if we can pull that out, it gives the client such a positive perspective about what they have to offer. Did you assume any responsibilities that were not part of your job? So we got to get outside of that job description. And then another one I always loved asking is, what would happen if you hadn't done that? You know, you said your job was just kind of a no-brainer. Well, let's talk about what would happen had you not done that. I also find it very helpful to go back and, look at their DISC assessment. I was interviewing a client the other day who was really struggling with being able to verbalize what he did. He was a recent college graduate. Well, I pulled out his DISC assessment, and I said, well, your DISC assessment says here that you're very good at creating processes and procedures that improve operations. Is that true? And he goes, yeah. I said, well, tell me about a time you did that. Oh, my God, I forgot all about that. So, you know, he gave me a really golden nugget to include in his resume only because of that ability to figure out what question to ask him. So when you ask good questions, you get good content. If you're not getting the good content from the client, maybe you're not asking the right question. Here's some additional ones that might work for those of you that are working with new graduates or students that are, currently in school. And I think I sent out a separate handout that address some of these specific questions that work well for students. So again, honing in on that, even if you get something as simple as have you traveled or lived anywhere else, that's not a yes-no answer. And if I used that client I worked with this week again as an example, he had on his resume that he did an internship in Ireland, but it was through excessive questioning and prodding and bringing out his theme that he was able to really share with me the extent of what that internship was, and even remember that he got a monetary scholarship to pay for the cost of going to Ireland to complete this internship. And in the end, we focused on things that were very different from what he originally had in his resume, because his original wording was not supporting his job goal. So you really have to dig in with these clients sometimes and, get your elbow right in there and see what you can pull out. Other ways you can get accomplishments. Ask the client if they have any performance appraisals. if all they're getting on their performance appraisals is, numbers or an X under the column that says exceeds performance, then see if you can't pull that together. I just recently completed a resume for a client whose performance standards had no narrative from the employer, but she did get a rating of 5 out of 1 to 5 rating. She got a rating of 5 on 90% of her performance criteria. So I created a section on the resume where I just put it in a nice little graphic, number 5, big, bold color, and then indicated that she had gotten a 5 on these following performance ratings year after year. So if anybody's interested in seeing that, I can show you. So that's one way. Another way is look at the narrative that the employer wrote, if they wrote something. A lot of times we get our performance reviews and we file them away and we completely forget about projects we did years ago. So have your client go back and dig those out and see if there's any nuggets in there. You can ask about their awards and accommodations, or even if they ever got, an email or a phone call, or just somebody said something in passing about their work style, their contributions, then figure out a way to work that in there as an accomplishment. And then, you can frame those questions around specific skills. So if we go back to, Candace saying that she's good in working with social media, then you would ask, tell me about a time you worked with social media. What was the situation? What action did you take? How did that affect the company? What was the outcome? So just drilling down and getting the information, looking back at your strategy, and then trying to figure out how do I structure this in such a way that it clearly represents the client. Okay, the next thing is this issue of quantifying. It's not always possible. No matter how many ways we go at it with a client, there are situations where we can't quantify. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So when it comes to quantifying, there's a couple of different, more than a couple, but there's some strategies for how you can do that. You could ask about the prior year's goal or the company average and write a statement that compares where the client is now or where the company is now to where it was before. So maybe the client himself was not totally instrumental for increasing the branch ranking, but that doesn't mean that he or she didn't make a contribution. So you can work that in there. Reveal how long the problem existed. That was one of the questions I asked this new college graduate. He said in his old resume, redid the office files. And I said, well, what did that mean? Well, I organized them. I said, well, why did you organize them? Well, because it was really hard to find things. Well, why was it hard? Well, because nobody had a filing system. Well, how long had that been going on? Well, there was about 9 years worth of files that I had to organize. So getting down to the root by repeatedly asking questions, which, again, I know you can't do for homework because we can't call Candace. But when you're working with your own clients, just keep going until you can get something out of them and reveal that information. So even like this second example under how long the problem existed, did something that had an instrumental effect on the company. So you see here a membership drive that, surpassed the company's 77-year history. So that's the way to quantify. You're not really quantifying what the client did, but you're quantifying the problem that was solved and how long it existed. So that is an effective strategy. Another thing is you quantify how many people were impacted. If they, developed a new process and procedure, how many people were going to be using that new process and procedure? If they, did a presentation, how many people were there present at that presentation? If they were managing a project, how many people were on the project team? And what role did they play that might have distinguished them from other people on the team? And then the other point to keep in mind when you're actually quantifying is when you've got a publicly traded company, which means all their finances, all of their clients is public knowledge. You go to the right sources, you can find that information. Then it's okay to reveal details. If you have a private company, and if you're not sure, always ask your client, is it going to be a problem if we share the company revenues? Is it going to be a problem if we mention the name of the client that you were working with? And if it is, then we really want to look at modifying the language to not be as specific. So in these two examples, instead of saying $25 million in revenue, you may want to translate it to a percentage. Instead of saying that, the sales went up from 25 to 100,000, just use an adjective to describe that. Don't call out confidential information that may create a problem for the client. And if, like you say, if you're not sure, ask the client. Another way, too, is if I don't even want to get the client back on the phone, I'm working with a client right now who works for a large consulting firm, and he was very forthcoming with the names of the companies that he consulted with. So when I went to the consulting firm's website and saw that they had these clients listed on their website, it was a green light that it was okay for us to include client names in the resume. So you want to be careful about that. Now, this next screen was probably one of my favorite finds. As a matter of fact, I just modified the PowerPoint for this class because I love what I just found here. Make note of that URL, percentagecalculator.net. And here's a little screenshot of what you'll find when you click on that. And all you got to do is plug your numbers in and hit calculate, and it'll give you the correct percentage. Calculating percentages has always been one of those math issues that I have struggled with, and I can't tell you how many ways I'll try to figure it out by adding, subtracting, dividing, and everything else. And when I found this calculator, my life became a whole lot easier. It's really important that you take the time to do this because sometimes we see percentages that just don't look realistic. And an example I have seen frequently in the NCRW test is in the profile we include some numbers, and many times we'll get a test back where somebody is mentioning that the client increased sales 1,400%. That may be, I don't know, but when you see a number that high, you kind of scratch your head and it brings things into question. So we want our percentages and our numbers to look realistic, and this little tool here can help you with that. So just a little bit more on quantifying, and then I'll see if there's any questions or comments about that before I break down the technique. So keep in mind that whatever position somebody has, there are numbers that are relevant. And whatever industry, there are numbers that are relevant. So what I've given you here on this slide are some examples of how it doesn't really matter whether it's a college student or a blue-collar production worker or, somebody that's in a lead finance executive position. There's always ways that we can drill down and get some kind of accomplishments. One thing that I somewhat did deliberately with Candace's profile is that a lot of her things aren't quantified. So that may challenge you to go a little bit deeper and figure out, can I write this so it sounds like an accomplishment instead of just writing it so it sounds like a responsibility? And in the homework assignment, some of you, I actually called out a phrase that sounded like it could be an accomplishment. So you set those aside and you figure out a way to work them in. When you do the NCRW test, the profile does have numbers all through it, so you won't struggle with it. When you submit your sample to be reviewed, and I'll cover this again and when I get to the last session about next steps, but a first step when you want to get certified is to submit a sample of a resume that you wrote and a cover letter that you wrote for any client. One of the things that we often find is those samples don't have any accomplishments quantified. When you send in your sample, we don't know the client. We don't know what they really did. So make up some numbers so that we know that you know how to quantify an accomplishment. Otherwise, we're going to look at your sample and we're just not going to know, did they not understand that this was essential or they just weren't able to get something. So just modify your sample, but when you get to the test, you'll actually have numbers. And there are a few in Canvases, but not anywhere near the number that we'd like to have. So let me just unmute the line again, because I'm next going to go in and talk about actually how to develop these statements. And let me just see if anybody had
edu.
Okay, starting at the top of the alphabet this time. Christina?
Yes, I actually have a question about going back to the performance appraisals. I was wondering if it's more effective to just summarize some of the key points from the appraisal, or if it's better to use an actual quote. And then if you use a quote, if you need to get permission from the person who wrote the review in order to quote them on a resume.
Wow, that's a lot of questions in there. This is like a press conference. Yes, all of that. Christina's bringing up some really good points. If there is a really good quote in the performance review, you can lift it out of there. And when I say really good, it's got to be something that has substance, not just Christina was a really nice employee and everybody got along with her. It needs to have something of substance. The second thing that you want to keep in mind when you're lifting a quote is if it's not well written, because unfortunately a lot of supervisors don't write well, as the resume writer, you have permission to modify that quotation. Make it grammatically correct. As far as getting the permission, you can ask the client if that might be an issue. I think a better strategy is to just don't identify who wrote the quote. Just say something like, supervisor, former supervisor, head of finance department, something like that, so that you're giving them a frame of reference, but you're not actually calling out the person who said it. So did I cover all your questions, Christina?
Yes, you did. Thanks.
Okay, good. Good questions, though. Doug, are you there?
Yes, I am, if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. How far back do you go with these probing questions? All the way back through the work history, at least as far back as you're including in the resume, and it's a lot of questions for a lot of positions.
Yeah, when you're developing the content, if you want to use all the positions going back, say, 10 to 15 years, when you're doing your accomplishments, as you move back to the earlier dates, you'll tend to have fewer accomplishments. Mm-hmm. So kind of a good rule of thumb is current positions may have 3 to 5, or they may have categories of 3 to 5. And then as you go back earlier and earlier in the career, you're going to have fewer and fewer accomplishments. And it's quite possible that the earlier jobs you won't have any accomplishments. Now, there's a caveat to that. If their best accomplishments were much earlier in their career, then group them together and put them on page 1 under a section you're calling, key accomplishments or highlights of accomplishments, and then bring them all up front so that you're not losing that critical information. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Yeah, and if anybody ever wants to see any examples of doing that, you can let me know. It seems as though lately I've been guiding a lot of writers on how to bring those accomplishments to page 1. Keeping in mind when ATS is scanning a resume and ranking it, whatever is on page 1 gets more points than what's on page 2. So we always want to get that critical information up front. Ronnie.
I would just like to say, if you could just send those copies to us, or a copy of that would be great. I'm asking for that.
Copy of what?
Your key accomplishment sheet.
Oh, you mean when they're grouped together?
Yep.
It's going to vary from resume to resume. I mean, it wouldn't help if you didn't have the whole client. So what I would suggest, and this is what I do all the time, is if you're running into a situation while you're writing a resume and you go, oh, wow, these are really good accomplishments, but they were a long time ago, that's when you want to get in touch with me and say, how do I handle this? If I guide you on what you're working on, you're going to learn better than if I just always give you samples that you're not applying in your own work.
Well, then I'm fine. I'm okay.
Yeah. Okay. How about you, LJ?
All good. No questions. Just taking careful notes.
All right. Thank you. Suzanne? Okay. Tiffany? We only got one Tiffany on the phone tonight, Tiffany, so it's always you.
I'm with LJ. I'm good and taking lots of notes. Thank you.
Okay, good. And Brenda?
I'm with LJ and Tiffany.
Okay. And Mark? Oh, Mark's not on the phone. Sheila?
I'm good.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to mute you all again. And I'll jump into actually how we're going to develop these statements. So, figure out a starting point. So identify a skill. And if we look back at Candace, we might pick a soft skill like customer service. We might pick a hard skill like inventory control. Then frame the example around that skill. Always start with an action verb so that each accomplishment bullet starts with an action verb. And in general, most of your accomplishments will be past tense because by nature of the definition, accomplishment, it implies something that's already been done. However, in a current position, the accomplishment bullet may be an ongoing activity. So it's not hard and fast that they're all ED verbs. They may be present tense or active verbs, but just you want to have that verb in there. And then this Macintosh methodology. So let me introduce you to this, and hopefully you'll see how it begins to fit together. So the idea is to look at the who, the what, the when, or the where, the when, the why, the how, and the how much. And when you break that all down, then you get to the result. So let me show you a little bit how that works. If we take a specific example here, we're trying to get down to summarizing the accomplishment. So these aren't things you're asking your client. You've already gotten the information from your client through worksheets and through your interview with the client. It's when you're sitting there looking at your notes and figuring out how am I going to craft this into a very concise accomplishment bullet that hopefully will be quantified. And I can tell you, I've been writing resumes for years. I can sit and look at something for a half hour to 45 minutes before I actually get everything to click. So be patient with yourself. So if we use this as an example, the who. So, we're working towards a result. This story that you're going to talk about. Let's say we're picking out a skill like inventory control. Well, who were you doing that with? So worked with the CEO. Well, what did you do when you were working with that person? Well, I worked with the CEO on a competitive analysis. Well, where did you do that? Where did it apply? Well, I worked with the CEO on a competitive analysis in the Midwest territory. And you go down to the next level. Well, when did you do it? Or for how long did you do it? Well, I worked with the CEO on a competitive market analysis in the Midwest territory during a 10-month assignment. Why did you do it? Well, I worked with the CEO on a competitive market analysis in the Midwest territory during a 10-month assignment. The why? It was aimed at increasing the revenues. That's why I was doing it. This is where I was doing it. This is how long I did it. This is who I did it with. Well, then you go down to the next level. Well, how did you do it? How did you do it? So this is through launching a new product line. That's how they worked on the competitive market analysis to increase the revenues. They increased the revenues by launching a new product line. Well, how much did those revenues increase? They increased 22%. So now you've got a very long statement that is giving us all the key elements. What did you do? Who did you do it with? When did you do it? How long did you do it? Where did you do it? What was the outcome? The key then, and where Sally's strategy really clicked for me, was now that you got all of that, turn it around and edit it. And this is what we're talking about when we say front load your accomplishment. So if you go back and look at this other statement here, it's starting with I performed this task and I did it over this amount of time, and this is why I did it. And here was the result. If you write it out that way, then before you put it on the resume as a final, you turn it around and you bring the result to the front of the sentence. Increase revenues in the Midwest territory 22% in less than 1 year. Because remember, we've got a whole lot of details in here. The Midwest territory, we're talking about 10 months. We're talking about the increasing the revenue, and then even worked in those details about working with the CEO on the competitive market analysis that drove the launch of a new product line. So you start with a lot of stuff, you organize it, you get all the details down, and then you go back and you edit out the fluff, you turn it around, and you put that accomplishment at the beginning of the bullet. And front-loading the accomplishment is such a critical piece, and you can really tell how it elevates the resume writer's abilities when you're reading resumes where the accomplishment is the first thing that the employer sees, as opposed to reading through what they did and then landing on the accomplishment. So if nothing more, if the client really wanted to condense this, make this resume really short, just leave it, increase revenues in Midwest territory 22%. Make sure that the client knows the rest of the story. Send them out the door to the interview, and when they get to the interviewer hopefully will ask, how did you increase the revenues in the Midwest territory? And the client is all prepared to tell them because you've already taken the time to flush out the details and the steps. So just to emphasize, though, I'm not saying keep it short on the resume. Just delete the in less than 1 year by working with. But what I am saying is if that first part stood alone, it would still have impact. And when you add the additional information, it's essential that you write tightly and don't write verbosely, don't overwrite, don't throw in a lot of adjectives. Just keep the critical information there. And, if this were typed on a resume, it's probably only going to be one line of text, if not 1.5. So it's not that it's a lot of information that people have to read. So when we talk about the relevance, as you're working on the resume, you want to figure out, well, what are the skills that I want to emphasize? And you begin that who, what, where, and when around that particular skill. So hopefully this concept will sink in, and if not, I'll be happy to revisit with you one-on-one. But if you think about a particular task, and this is important when you're thinking about Candace, because some of you focused on her managing inventory and her ability to, put order into chaos. Some of you focused on her sales skills and her customer service. Some of you focused on both. But what you're focusing on in terms of the task will help you to decide, how do I want to frame the accomplishment? So let's take, for an example, we have a client that developed a new standard operating procedure. And maybe we got 10 clients that did it. But each of those clients has a different skill set. Each of those clients has a different behavioral style. Each of those clients probably approached developing the SOP a little bit differently. So if client A is saying, I want the employer to know I'm an analytical thinker, then the action would be that they developed an SOP by assessing the operational gaps. They were analyzing what was going on. If the client says, well, I want to emphasize that I do research and writing really well, we're going to take the same task, but now we're going to say they developed the SOP by gathering and summarizing information. Maybe the client wants to emphasize that they take initiative. Well, then we're going to say they developed an SOP by identifying and correcting. Nobody told them to do it. They identified it, and they corrected it. If you go on to other skill sets, again, same task. The client wants to emphasize his or her leadership skills. So this time we're going to say developed an SOP by organizing and leading an interdepartmental committee. So we've got those words in there, leadership, and we got not that they were performing the task, but they were directing, supervising the performance of the task. Maybe the client wants to emphasize their computer skills. So in this case, the client developed an SOP by beta testing and documenting the steps for performing XYZ. So putting emphasis on computer terminology and computer task. Maybe the client wants to emphasize conflict management. Who would have thought that would have to do with an SOP? But in this case, we can say they developed an SOP which helped diffuse growing tension in the department. So each of these tasks can be approached differently depending on what skill the client wants to emphasize or you want to emphasize, depending on the theme that you're trying to communicate. So when you do next week's assignment, revisit your theme, revisit your key words, and then look at how do you want to present Candace. Do you want to present her as somebody who's analytical, well organized, develops processes and procedures, creates order out of chaos? Or do you want to emphasize maybe that she's somebody that uses computer skills, or that she takes initiative, or that she works well with clients? There may be a combination of all of these things, but the theme should always be consistent. If you're presenting Candace as a person with a sales type of personality, even the way she manages inventory is going to be different than if you're presenting her as a very analytical, regimented person. And if you wanted to present her as a leader, you would be using terminology that shows she initiated the task, she managed people that performed the task, but always making sure that you've got a theme that's presenting your client the way you want them to be presented. So when you go back then and you look at the overall formula for the bullet, it's the action, what action was performed, to who or what was the action performed, how and why was it performed, and then what was the outcome. So if you do that example here, the action conceived and recommended. What did they conceive and recommended? A unique engine design. How or why and what was the impact? It contributed to annual cost savings of $13 million. Then you can turn it around, facilitated a $13 million annual cost savings in warranty claims by, and now you've got the action, the who, or the what. If you look at a lot of resumes, particularly ones that, maybe students are completing when they were in college, or a fairly novice resume writer, you'll find in many cases the bullets tell the action, the who and the what and the why, but they forget the results. Or they only tell the action and the who or the why, or who or the what, and they don't explain why they were performing that action. So if they can't explain why they were doing it and the impact, then it goes to the job description section. If they can tell you why they were doing it and what the impact was, it goes as an accomplishment bullet. So use that kind of as your frame of reference. And then if it's in the accomplishment bullet and you can quantify it, now you're even one step further. So the last few slides here, we're going to talk about the formatting guidelines. I said it, and I just keep saying it. Distinguish the accomplishments from the duties by using bullets or symbols. Plain and simple. We don't want to look at long lines of 10, 12, 15 bullets and try to figure out which ones distinguish the client and which ones were just common duties and responsibilities. Write concise and stick to one topic per bullet. So don't try to combine too many different things in there. If Candace organized the stock room, don't try to also work in the same bullet that she, put more merchandise in the retail showroom, because they're two different things. So don't try to combine too much. The ideal length of a bullet is 2 to 3 lines. Again, we want to write tight. We don't want to get big blocks of text. And then the ideal bullet per position would be 2 to 5. That's just kind of an ideal. That doesn't mean you can't have more. Doesn't mean you can't have less. A good strategy is if you have several bullets, you may want to break them down, and I'll show you that in the next slide. And then just remember to write tight. And some good examples are just get rid of the by. If they increase revenues 37%, you don't have to write in by 37%. Try using those ing verbs. Instead of delivered 3.2 million revenues by securing or while securing, just put it in a comma and use the ing verb. So here's a couple of examples that I can share with you. One is when you've got a lot of accomplishments. We could have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bullets all in a row, which then becomes distracting to look at. It's hard to break things out. It's hard to compartmentalize when we're reading. So if you've got a lot of bullets, see if you can group them. So this is an example of, here's the things they accomplished related to social media. Here's what they accomplished related to project management. Here's what they accomplished related to technology. Good strategy for Candace's job with Western Equipment, because she seemed to have done 2 very different roles, sometimes overlapping. So that's a strategy. Also, things that you may notice here are, some of the beginning of it is in bold, calling out keywords, kind of gives an ability to quickly scan and not have to read the whole sentence initially, but you get an idea right away of the value the client's bringing. Restaffed and trained and built an entirely new team. Tripled the social media engagement. Managed from concept to design. Spearheaded a highly successful. So you can kind of just scan through there and pick out the key information without reading the whole thing initially. Another strategy is sometimes accomplishments get very cumbersome because there's a lot of elements that went into it. So you could consider breaking it down into sub-bullets. So this first example is, here was the overall accomplishment, and then here's some of the results of that accomplishment. So using some subheadings, some bullets, things that will direct the reader to specific sections of the resume, specific areas. If this had all been blended into one sentence, it would have been a very, very cumbersome sentence. So the sub-bullets will help you with that. The next one is just another example, breaking out a sub-bullet, but not calling out specific categories. If I recall, in my first example there, I used that strategy throughout his resume then is, I like this. He always had results, and he was always winning awards. So I'm going to set up all of his work experience using that format. So as you're working on the resume, you may be changing your strategy. You may be modifying it. You may find that it's coming together while you're writing, and you don't even know until you're done what you've come up with. Okay, another strategy for formatting is starting with a key word. So at the beginning of each of these 3 bullets, there is a key skill that is in bold font, and then the accomplishment statement is built around that. And as you notice, that first one, I think even the second one, it's not quantified. But it's okay because it was still a contribution. So don't get to the point where you're thinking, oh, gosh, they didn't give me any numbers. I can't come up with any accomplishments. You can. They don't always have to be quantified. The next example that I gave you there is not only starting with a key word, but also breaking down what the results were in just little snippets of information. Kind of a creative use of the ellipsis. The ellipsis typically is used to signify missing information, but for formatting, you can always use an ellipsis to connect ideas. These are short little phrases. Cleaner than listing them out, one below the next one, but definitely is pulling out what was the contribution of this particular activity that was performed. So that is all the stuff I had in tonight's slides. We'll go through, do another Q&A. The other thing I meant to say, and I'll say it now when it comes to starting to work on the content, the more good examples you look at, the easier it's going to be for you. When I was first beginning out as a resume writer, I rarely wrote a resume without looking for some examples in books that reflected what I was writing about. So even now, when I get stuck, I'll go look at other resumes. I may go to a website. Most of the nationally certified resume writers have samples on their website. Go look at their samples. Find out how they were doing it. Look at examples in books and make sure you're using the most current books. Don't, pull something off the shelf that was dated back in, 1992, because those examples are obsolete now. You probably know that Wendy Antelope and Louise Kurzmark just put out the Modernize Your Resume book. That's got a lot of really good, strong examples in it. If you see an example that isn't adhering to this paragraph format for job descriptions, just set that aside for right now, because for this class we want to use that paragraph format. Sometimes I find, yesterday, I'll give you a good example. I was trying to write a summary for a client, and I just couldn't get started. So I found a sample that was written by one of our colleagues, someone I have a tremendous respect for. And I really thought what she wrote was very much like what my client did. So the first thing I did is I took everything she wrote verbatim and I put them on my client's resume. And then I started editing, massaging, rearranging. And in the end, what I had was not plagiarism, because it was unique to my client, but it was that extra boost I got from seeing how someone else had handled it. So if that's not a strategy you've tried yet, you may want to just give it a shot. Pull up another resume that's similar and start with whatever that writer wrote, and then massage it and make it your own, because it's easy to get writer's block. It's very easy, and I get it all the time. So that's can be very helpful for you. So what we're going to be working on next is the actual professional summary section. And as I always tell my clients, it's the first thing that they see on the resume, but it's the last thing we write. So that's why I pushed it back to session 6, because I don't want you thinking about that until you've got all this other stuff together. But that's not next week's homework. Next week's homework is going to be accomplishments, and I will send out specific instructions on that. So let me just unmute the line. We'll do another Q&A, and I think we're going to get done on time tonight. Yay! Okay.
Lectures and
okay, so I'll jump all over now. Sheila, questions, comments, things you've done.
No questions or comments. This was
you're overwhelmed.
Not so overwhelmed. This was a great session. I'm still digesting it, but I love all the examples in the PowerPoint here.
Good. Yeah, there's a lot of meat in here. This one's a hefty session. How about you, Brenda?
I really like Sally McIntosh. That was very clear. That just made my eyes open wide. I'm going, wow, look at that.
Well, good. I'll pass that feedback on to her. I did tell her I named it after her, so she was okay with that. Christina.
I think I'm pretty good. It all makes sense. I think it's really just digesting it.
Yes, it is. Doug.
I lost about 10 minutes of audio there, so didn't follow everything. I'll have to get the recorded version. But if I can abuse your time and go back to an earlier one where you mentioned probing questions, ask about travel or having lived elsewhere. I've worked internationally, so I understand the value of international experience. But what does your typical employer care?
Well, it's really, again, going to get down to your target audience. if the employer is a global company, if they're doing business overseas, if it's important to them to have someone that is culturally sensitive, that has the ability to work with a lot of different ethnic, cultural groups, then it could really have a lot of value to be able to make it apparent that this client, didn't live in their own little world with no exposure to anything else.
Okay, good. I somehow interpreted it as being useful in general on a resume.
It depends on your audience.
Got it.
It really does. On the other hand, I remember I had a client once. It had nothing to do with the actual job, but one of the things he did is he took a gap year after college and he hitchhiked all over Europe. Well, that was a good way to show initiative, ability to do planning, ability to set and achieve goals. So I worked it in under the bottom section of the resume, like an additional information section. Sometimes you can just work it into the professional summary as a one-liner.
Okay.
Self-motivated professional who backpacked across Europe.
All right.
So you've emphasized it in two different ways.
All right.
Okay. Tiffany?
I think I'm good. Some good information. I'm glad I'm not the only one that has looked at examples and kind of used them to ignite imagination or get me started. So I appreciate that. It wasn't an odd thing to do.
You have my permission. I always tell clients it's the only industry where not only is plagiarism acceptable, but it's often encouraged. But it's not strict plagiarism. It's massaging what somebody else wrote.
It's amazing how it can just get you started when you're having a moment.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, good. Thank you. Suzanne? And LJ?
I really like the Macintosh methodology. I'm super excited to try that. And I actually had to Google ellipses because I didn't know what those three little dots were called, and I wasn't able to keep up with what you were how you were explaining it. So that's something.
The ellipsis, yeah. It's hard to spell, too. And aren't we glad that Sally's last name is really McIntosh? Because if it was the Gallagher methodology, it wouldn't sound quite as classy, would it?
It would have had a lot more adverbs in it.
Oh, would it? Okay.
For sure.
And then I think, Ronnie, you were the last one.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm fine. Everything's great.
Everything's fine. Everything's great. I don't know if you guys just tell me that too, so that I'll smile when I get off the phone, or if you really mean it. So when you do the next assignment, if you want to go back in there then and re-massage this week's assignment, now that you've got new information, then send me that. And
definitely.
Some of you did you really went out of your way to actually kind of create an outline for the whole resume, and that'll be great because now you can go back in and plug in the accomplishments, and then next week you can go back in and plug in the summary, and then the following week you can go in and you can format it, and that way you'll be working with it up to the very end. And I also get to call you out when you have grammatical errors, so that'll give you more practice on those, and it's much more enjoyable, I think, to learn grammar when you're applying it to something you're writing instead of just listening to this is what a noun is, this is what a verb is. So thank you so much again for your time. I hope everybody has an awesome weekend, and I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye-bye.